Hello, good afternoon. I wanted to pop on here for a 10-minute or less live just to go through birth control and post birth control and what that looks like and what that means. And I think we think of birth control as something that only young people have to worry about. But I want to talk about why going through being on birth control may impact your hormones and what happens after being on birth control and what you can typically expect. So, let's just talk about kind of what birth control does. So, when we're talking about birth control, keep in mind I'm referring to the pill, I'm referring to the IUD, I'm referring to the patch, I'm referring to injections, anything with hormones. So truly, the only thing that I'm not referring to essentially is basically the copper IUD. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about birth control. The reason why I wanted to bring it up and talk about kind of birth control through the life cycle is because typically what happens is you get put on birth control, you kind of go through your life, you decide if you want to have babies, if you don't. If you do want to have babies, usually come off of birth control and you get pregnant. And then a lot of the times, even when you're breastfeeding, your doctor will say, well, do you want to get pregnant again? You better go back on birth control. So that's kind of the sentiment. And that's what we're usually prescribed as patients. So then it's kind of like, well, what's the next move? This is always my question when I'm talking about my patient or talking to my patients rather about what medications they're on or kind of what their treatment plan is. Even with supplements, it's like, but what's the next move? Like, is this the life? Or is this you're going to be on this for the rest of your life, or are things going to change? And if so, when? And if so, what are we looking for? And how do we know that we need to make a change? And how do we know that we need to reassess? So I talk to my patients about this a lot, especially as it pertains to the perimenopause and menopausal state. And so I'm going to go back to kind of what happens when you're cycling. So basically, what happens is you're cycling, you have a period, you get put on birth control for whatever the case may be. A very few of the patients I speak with actually got put on birth control for birth control, which is kind of ironic. Typically, they're put on for like heavy periods, painful periods. Maybe they didn't have a period. A lot of times I'll have a patient, they're like 25 or 28 or 30, and they'll say, yeah, I've been put on birth control because I had irregular periods at the age of 13. And my doctor said I had PCOS and they just put me on birth control. And I'm like, wait. You were 13. When did you get your period? They're like, yeah, 13. Like, okay. So the minute you got your period, it wasn't coming regularly. And so your doctor threw you on birth control. And so we're kind of labeled with whatever happens, we're put on birth control and we're really just sent on our way, right? And so I just want to kind of look at the reason. First of all, why did you go on birth control is really going to be a predictor of what's going to happen after. A lot of women who are younger, who maybe are in the family planning stages, will come up to me and say, well, I'm worried that I'm not going to get pregnant because I've been on birth control for so long. It's not necessarily the birth control itself that would impact fertility. Now, there is an argument to be made that it can possibly play a little bit of a role. Now, the research doesn't support that. But a mechanism of action as to how birth control works is it shuts off the communication between your brain and your ovaries. And so that communication is required for your eggs to develop, mature, ovulate, and then for you to then get pregnant and hold that pregnancy. And so when we shut off that communication, sometimes our body isn't really good at connecting it again. And I find there's a few different patterns that happen when my patients come off of birth control. The first pattern is kind of an obvious pattern. You're on birth control for whatever amount of time you come off. Keep in mind when you come off of birth control, a few things to remember and to understand is that when you're on birth control, you don't have a real period, you have a withdrawal bleed. And so the only reason why you're bleeding is because of that hormone withdrawal. And so you basically are given these synthetic hormones, and then the hormones are being taken away with the sugar pill or that week where you don't take anything in some cases, depending on what you're taking. Then you have a bleed. That is a withdrawal bleed. So it's not your hormones actively cycling. It is the synthetic hormones kind of just doing their thing. So the first time you stop birth control, if you stopped cold turkey or you stop at the end of a pack, you're going to get a withdrawal bleed. That is not a period. Okay. So when we're waiting for your next bleed, we're waiting for the next time you bleed on your own without the impact of birth control or without needing birth control. Right. And so oftentimes what I'll see is you'll come off, you'll be on for 10 years, you have your withdrawal bleed, and then your periods just resume regularly. Typically, this is in people who maybe they just went on for birth control. nothing else. Their periods were fine before. And so maybe they weren't on for that long. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Typically, when I see people who are on like 4 or 5 years and they only went on for birth control, I usually don't see a big impact, especially as it pertains to how long it takes to get pregnant after. But what happens is you'll come off, you'll have your withdrawal, and then your periods will just resume and it's all good. The second thing that I see very often, I see these other two scenarios, unfortunately, a lot more often than the first scenario I just described to you. So the other two scenarios I see where you come off of birth control, you have your withdrawal bleed, and then you might have a regular period for like 3 months, maybe 4 months. And I myself experienced this. So you have a regular period for 3 months. And then after that, your body's kind of like, okay, we are done with these synthetic hormones. Now, how do we do this on our own? And your body cannot figure it out. And so I suffered from what a naturopathic doctor would call post-birth control syndrome. Now, I've actually seen this in my practice where this can actually happen for years. Like I've seen a patient come off of birth control, maybe they have 1 or 2 regular cycles, and then it's just wonky. Their acne is through the roof. They're not having regular periods. Things are insane. And then they go see their doctor and their doctor says, well, you have PCOS. Here's birth control. And you're kind of like, no, this is why I came off in the first place, is because I wanted to have regular periods. And now the problem is here and I don't know how to fix it. And it's not going back to what I was on before. So coming back to that and really evaluating that, like I said, that's what I suffered from, is this post-birth control. The third scenario, which I often see too, is kind of where it all just wreaks havoc right off the cuff. So you come off of birth control and things are just wild. And so why does this matter? Your birth control, like I said, disconnects when you stopped taking birth control. You're supposed to reestablish that connection. Your body has to somehow figure out, how do I communicate between my brain and my ovaries? And if you started birth control so young, your body didn't even establish that connection to start with. And so if you've been on birth control since 13, for me, I was 13 till the age of 23. My body didn't even know what it was like past puberty to even regulate a period. And so I came off and it was like 60-day cycles, 70-day cycles, because my brain was trying really hard to recommunicate and reconnect with my ovaries. And it was a connection that I hadn't even been able to make. So that's what happens when we're really young and we're put on birth control. But what can happen also is I always say whatever was going on before you went on birth control is probably going to be going on when you come off. What do I mean by that? If you had irregular periods because of PCOS, or you had acne because of PCOS, etc., the PCOS is still going to be there. If you had endometriosis before, it's still going to be there. To what degree it comes back or flares up is really person dependent. And like I said, I've seen this post-birth control syndrome happen for years. And so I've had women it's been wonky for years, and we worked kind of to reestablish that communication, which can happen. For myself, I had a lot of things in the way, stress being a huge part of that. But I did a lot of things working with my own naturopathic doctor to reestablish that connection: herbs, acupuncture, diet, exercise, stress management, like all the things. And it really took a long time. And if you follow me and you know me, you know that I always struggle from acne. It's like my big crutch. So that has kind of leveled out, but it's always a battle. I find everyone has like their one thing. Some people it's their digestion, some people it's their skin, some people it's other things that pop up. It's like, this is what happens when I'm stressed. What state does your body go into? Now I had just, my dog suddenly passed away last week. So this is why I haven't been really present, but I got a cold sore. So it's kind of like, where does your body go? It's the same thing with periods, right? If you're on birth control, we're just in symptom management mode. And so when we pull that out, whatever was going to come up is going to come up anyways. And so what happens in that menopause stage? So typically when you are pregnant and then you have a baby, your doctor's like, well, do you want to get pregnant? You're like, no, I am like 6 weeks postpartum. So they put you on birth control. And I find that usually it's a progesterone only. That's the first thing. And the reason why is because you can't give estrogen while you're breastfeeding. But the other thing that I don't love about this approach is that I have seen research to connect the progesterone, the synthetic progesterone in birth control, with mood issues. Postpartum depression obviously is a risk after having a baby. And so if there's an increased risk of mood issues, then your doctor should have that conversation with you, so you're not choosing to go on progesterone only birth control if you are prone to postpartum depression. I know I had it with both my boys. So if you're someone that knows that, or maybe it's your first, you have no idea, but you're prone to depression, this is a conversation you want to have. And in the perimenopausal state, it's like looking at the piece as to, well, I just went live before this and it didn't work with my camera. So you might see two, but I'm going to repost this one. But looking at the perimenopausal stage, I see a lot of women as well. They're like, I'm done having children, but like, I don't know. I'm just on birth control. I'm just whatever. Sometimes they have a period, sometimes they don't. It doesn't really matter when you're on hormonal birth control. But their doctor has said, yeah, just take it until you like go into menopause. And it's like, how are you supposed to know that you're going into menopause if you're on birth control, right? The other thing is when you are going into perimenopause and menopause, we have this slow decline of hormones. And so what happens is you make hormones from your ovaries, and then what happens is as you're going through perimenopause, menopause, that role is going to shift. We end up seeing less hormones made from your ovaries, and more of that goes onto the role of the adrenal glands. And so if you're already highly stressed, and think about it, we've already shut off, birth control is shutting off the communication between the brain and the thyroid. So first of all, you might not know if you go into menopause. And second of all, when you do choose to come off, because you're not going to be on for the rest of your life, when you do choose to come off, we've really just pulled the rug out from under you. Because if you're at the age where you're no longer, like your body's like, we're out, we are not making hormones anymore. Your adrenal glands are kind of making a little bit, and you've been on these synthetic hormones for so long, that drop that was supposed to be like do 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 is going to be like bam, and you're going to go from 0 to 100. And so this is what I have this conversation with my patients who are perimenopausal, and they're like, yeah, I'm on birth control, I don't want any more kids. Maybe their partner has a vasectomy, maybe they don't have a partner, like it really doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, we have to reestablish, okay, where are we going with this, and how do we want to manage this? Because at some point you have to come off, and my intention is always to make the situation better before it gets worse, or to at least alleviate a piece that I might be able to predict is coming. Another situation is where you may have PCOS, but your doctor really did nothing about it. Or maybe you suspect you had PCOS and now you're in your 50s, and maybe you didn't lose your period all the way. Maybe it's coming here and there. And you just got put on birth control because the only reason your doctor cared about your PCOS is because you were trying to get pregnant. You got pregnant, you had your kids, all good there. So they were like, okay, we no longer have to worry about this. You get put on birth control, same thing. It's like, well, what is the end goal here, right? We pull the rug out from under you. Now your body's trying to reestablish that connection between the brain and the ovaries. Now your perimenopause is probably way worse than it would have been, because not only were you going to have that natural decline in hormones, but now we've just taken away those synthetic hormones and we've really messed with your body. And so this is where I find birth control to be an issue. I had a supervisor once tell me that birth control is a tool that we use for a short-term intervention in girls, young girls who are just figuring out not getting pregnant. And I would totally agree with that sentiment, because I find that it disrupts our hormones in such a way that it's truly not worth from what I know about it, in my own experiences and working with patients, it's just truly not worth the long-term what happens. Now, do I know if that would have happened to me before being put on? Like if it would have happened anyways, you don't know, right? These are things you don't know. I know that I have a family history of fibroids and endometriosis. I went on birth control because I went to the doctor one day at 13 and said, I have acne. And she probably thought, oh, this person is going to have sex soon, and put me on birth control without any conversation of what that would look like long term. So that's my quick spiel about birth control and just why I like to assess. Now, not everyone who sees me has to come off of birth control. It feels like a really scary thing. And I totally understand that sentiment, because we're taught that we're either on birth control or we're pregnant, or we're either on birth control or we have severe, severe symptoms. And so I don't pull the rug out from under my patients. We deal with it from a foundational perspective. And this is what all of my programs work through, is like getting you to the point where all the stuff underneath is dealt with. The sleep, the stress, the digestion, the environment, like everything is ready, so that when you decide to come off of hormones, your body's like, okay, one thing to deal with, right? Rather than saying my digestion's a mess, my stress is out of control, and everything else needs to be fixed. And then we take you off of birth control and you're like, whoa, 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 this is too much. Now my hormones are crazy, right? We have to deal with all of the foundations and working through those pieces before we decide to make those changes. But it's good to just kind of think about whether or not that's a good change for you, or take a look back and say, maybe my symptoms are as a result of coming off of birth control. And maybe I venture into this topic to talk about that further. So I have to jet, but if you guys have any questions, comment in the chat. And I hope everybody's having a really good day.